They dug out 1 billion tons of sand to fuel a construction boom. And for a moment it worked. Skyscrapers rose, highways cut across the desert, and China looked unstoppable. Then nature answered. Rivers thinned. A great lake sank. Sandstorms returned like an ancient army.
I saw a very high wall of sand coming towards me.
Was this progress, or a trap China set for themselves? The sand that built a nation. In the early 2000s, China was growing at a speed that stunned the world. New cities appeared where there had once been only farmland. Skyscrapers, highways, and bridges rose in every direction. It was one of the fastest urban expansions in human history. Every tower, every road, and every piece of glass or concrete had one thing in common. They all depended on sand. Sand is the hidden foundation of modern life. It is mixed into concrete for buildings, melted into glass for windows, and used in making microchips for electronics. For China's massive construction boom, sand was as valuable as gold. The demand seemed endless, but there was a problem. Not all sand could be used. The deserts that covered much of northern China looked like an obvious source. The Gobi, the Taklamakan, and the Badain Jaran seemed to hold limitless sand. Yet desert sand is useless for building. Its grains are too round and smooth, worn down by centuries of wind. When mixed into concrete, these grains cannot stick together properly. Builders need sharp, rough sand that could grip cement and hold strong under pressure. The only place to find this kind of sand is in riverbeds and lakes. So, as the nation's skyline climbed higher, a new industry began beneath the water. Huge dredging ships, some the size of apartment blocks, sand, loading it onto barges that fed the construction sites of Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. By 2020, China was using more than half of all the sand consumed on Earth, about 2 billion tons each year. The demand was so large that it could not be met by ordinary mining alone. Soon, rivers that had once run wide and clear began to thin, but that wasn't all. As China dug deeper for sand and as its urban expansions grew, it uncovered a much older enemy, one that had been silently growing for decades: deserts. The expanding deserts. For centuries, northern China has walked a fine line between green farmlands and golden deserts, but by the late 20th century, that line began to blur. What was once fertile, thriving land started to turn into a dry, lifeless sea of sand. Scientists called it desertification, and it was spreading rapidly. More than a quarter of China's total land area had already turned into desert. From Inner Mongolia to Gansu and creeping dangerously close to Beijing, patches of bare, cracked soil began to appear where crops once grew. This was not a sudden disaster. It was the slow result of years of human pressure on fragile ecosystems. Overgrazing was one of the main culprits. As China's population and economy grew, so did the demand for meat and dairy. Farmers increased their herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. These animals fed on what little grass remained, pulling it up by the roots. Once the ground was exposed, the top layer of soil had nothing to hold it together. The wind easily carried it away, leaving behind dust and gravel. Over-farming made things worse. The soil lost its nutrients and could no longer support crops. Trees were cut down for farmland and fuel, and deforestation became another silent enemy. Without tree roots to anchor the earth, rain began to wash away the remaining soil, and wind turned the land into dunes. Water scarcity added to the problem. The Yellow River, known as the cradle of Chinese civilization, began drying up during certain months in the 1990s. Industrial use, irrigation, and droughts drained its once powerful flow. This was a clear warning sign that the balance between people and nature was tipping. Every spring, powerful sandstorms would roar out of the Gobi Desert. They swept across entire cities, turning the sky orange and the air thick with dust. Streets disappeared under layers of fine sand. People had to wear masks just to breathe. Flights were grounded. Cars had to pull over on highways because visibility dropped to zero. Even Beijing, hundreds of miles away, was sometimes covered in a haze so thick that skyscrapers vanished into it. The storms did not just make life uncomfortable, they were a sign of a growing environmental crisis. Crops were dying, rivers were drying, and the air itself was turning against the people. Scientists warned that if nothing changed, the deserts in northern China would continue to expand and eventually merge into one massive wasteland stretching across multiple provinces. This threat forced the Chinese government to act. Losing millions of acres of farmland would not only cause hunger but could also displace millions of people. In some rural areas, entire villages had already been swallowed by shifting sands. Old farmlands were being abandoned and people were moving south in search of better conditions. The situation was becoming so severe that it demanded a national effort. China needed to stop the desert from spreading and somehow turn the tide back toward life. It would take decades, billions of trees, and countless hands to even attempt such a task. Their solution was as ambitious as it was risky: to build a living wall across the desert. The Great Green Wall. This environmental project was called the Three North Shelter Forest Program, but most people knew it as the Great Green Wall. It was born out of necessity. For decades, China's northern deserts had been expanding, driven by overfarming, drought, and wind erosion, burying villages and creeping closer to major cities. The sands didn't just stay still, they moved with the wind, swallowing farmland, blocking roads, and coating entire towns in dust. Every spring, massive sandstorms swept across the land, turning skies yellow and forcing thousands to flee. The plan was simple but massive: plant a living barrier of trees across the northern edge of the country to stop the sand from drifting south, reclaim land lost to moving dunes, and protect farmlands from being buried. Covering the three norths, the northwest, the north, and the northeast, it became the front line in China's fight against desertification. But this was easier said than done. The Gobi Desert, which sat at the heart of the problem, was one of the harshest environments on Earth. Winters could drop to -40 degrees Celsius, while summers could rise above 40 degrees Celsius. Rain was rare, and the little water that fell often evaporated within hours. Planting trees here was like trying to grow a forest on the moon's surface. Still, engineers, scientists, and volunteers pressed forward. They tested different methods to keep the trees alive. One innovation was the use of drip irrigation bags, which slowly released small amounts of water directly to each seedling's roots. This reduced waste and helped young trees survive in dry conditions. Another key idea was choosing the right species. Instead of regular trees, experts picked hardy ones that could adapt to extreme weather. Saxaul trees, native to Central Asia, were one of the best choices. Their roots could dig deep underground in search of moisture. Red willows and poplars were also planted in large numbers for their fast growth and ability to hold down the soil. Planting stretched across decades. Millions of people, from soldiers to farmers and students, joined the campaign. Some worked with machines, while others planted by hand, carrying young trees on their backs across miles of sand. It was a test of endurance, but slowly the wall began to take shape. By the 2000s, satellite images showed something remarkable. Areas that had once been dry and brown were now streaked with green. Forests were appearing along the desert's edge. In some regions, the desert had actually started to shrink for the first time in recorded history. Scientists confirmed that wind speeds had decreased, dust storms had lessened, and farmland near the wall was becoming more stable. By 2020, China had planted more than 66 billion trees as part of the Great Green Wall, stretching more than 4,500 kilometers across the country. It was one of the most ambitious reforestation efforts ever attempted, and in many ways, it was working. Cities that once faced yearly sandstorms began to see blue skies again. Fields that had turned to dust were returning to green. However, some experts began to warn that the project had a hidden flaw. In many areas, local planners had focused on fast-growing trees of a single type to meet targets quickly. This created what scientists call monoculture forests. Such forests look impressive but are weak on the inside. A single disease, pest, or weather change could wipe out large portions of them in a short time. Despite this success, China's hunger for sand was about to undo much of what it had achieved. The sand hunger paradox. As China's cities grew taller and wider, the country developed what scientists called sand hunger. Every new highway, skyscraper, bridge, and apartment block needed concrete, and concrete needed sand. Not just any kind, but the right kind. And since the only places to find this type of sand in large quantities were rivers, lakes, and coastal areas, miners turned their attention to China's waterways instead of the desert. Among their main targets was Lake Poyang, the country's largest freshwater lake and one of Asia's most important wetlands. What began as small-scale sand collection quickly turned into a full-scale industrial operation. By the mid-2010s, hundreds of massive dredging ships floated on Lake Poyang's surface. Each machine worked non-stop, sucking sand from the lake bed through long pipes and dumping it into waiting barges. The noise of engines and pumps echoed across the water day and night. Local fishermen described it as a constant thunder, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The numbers were shocking. In a single year, miners extracted more than 1 billion tons of sand from the lake. This was enough to fill hundreds of stadiums. The once peaceful lake began to change. Its clear waters turned murky, and the water level dropped by more than 25%. Entire sections of the lake bed that had been underwater for centuries were suddenly exposed to sunlight. This massive dredging did more than just alter the landscape. It shattered an entire ecosystem. But the largest and most shocking changes appeared at Lake Poyang, China's biggest freshwater lake, where more than 1 billion tons of sand had been removed. Once a rich, life-filled wetland, Lake Poyang was the heart of Jiangxi province. It supported millions of birds, fish, and farming families. But when industrial dredgers arrived, the lake's calm surface turned into a battlefield of machines. Hundreds of ships worked at once, carving deep trenches across the lake bed. The result was devastating. Fish populations collapsed almost overnight as their breeding grounds were destroyed. Species that depended on shallow, calm waters vanished, and the fishermen who had lived off the lake for generations could no longer make a living. Migratory birds that used Lake Poyang as a stopover on their journey from Siberia to Southeast Asia began to disappear too. Bird counts dropped by more than 90%. The famous Siberian cranes, one of the rarest birds in the world, lost their main wintering home. The lake's delicate ecosystem, which had survived for thousands of years, was on the brink of total collapse. Scientists who visited the area called it an ecological disaster unfolding in real time. The damage did not stop there. Lake Poyang had long acted as a natural buffer for the Yangtze River, helping to absorb excess water during the rainy season. But with its capacity reduced by sand mining, it could no longer hold back floodwaters. This increased the risk of flooding in nearby cities and farmland, threatening millions of lives each summer. Environmentalists began to sound the alarm. They warned that China was creating a new kind of desert not through drought or heat, but through over-extraction. The water was gone, the soil was stripped, and life was fading. It was as if the nation's drive to build upward was quietly hollowing out the earth beneath it. Yet even as warnings grew louder, the demand for sand showed no sign of slowing down. Cities needed to grow, and the world's largest population needed homes. To solve this crisis, China began investing heavily in new desert projects, not to fight nature, but to work with it. The Taklamakan transformation. Far out in western China lies one of the most dangerous deserts on Earth, the Taklamakan. Locals call it the Sea of Death. Stretching across more than 330,000 square kilometers, its rolling dunes can reach heights of over 300 meters. The air there is dry, the heat scorching by day, and the cold biting at night. Once, travelers who entered it rarely came back. Yet this was where China decided to challenge nature's fight against the billions of sand being dug up. After years of watching desert sand expand toward cities and farmland, the government launched a bold new experiment. If humans could destroy nature through overuse, maybe they could also restore it through science. The plan was simple but ambitious: to turn parts of the Taklamakan into stable living zones. Teams of workers, scientists, and engineers were sent into the desert carrying seedlings and irrigation tools. Using satellite data, they mapped out areas most vulnerable to sandstorms and began planting rows of drought-resistant trees. Unlike previous reforestation efforts, this one used advanced techniques. The trees were arranged in perfect grid patterns to block the wind and trap moving sand. Under the surface, long pipes carried water from nearby rivers through underground drip systems. These slow-release tubes gave each plant just enough moisture to survive, even under the blazing desert sun. Over the years, millions of trees were planted. Hardy species like saxol and haloxylon were chosen for their deep roots and ability to withstand extreme temperatures. Slowly, the bare dunes began to change color. From space, satellite images showed thin green lines stretching across the golden sand. It was a striking sight and proof that human hands could tame the desert, at least for a while. Farmers who had once abandoned their villages began to return. They started cultivating medicinal herbs and growing small crops suited to the dry climate. Some harvested desert-resistant timber for fuel and construction. What was once a place of death slowly turned into a new kind of life zone. Officials proudly called it the economic desert, where industries linked to renewable energy, ecotourism, and sustainable agriculture began to thrive. For a time, it seemed China had achieved the impossible. The Taklamakan was shrinking at its edges, its sandstorms weakening. Scientists celebrated it as one of the few success stories in the global fight against desertification. But as the years passed, subtle warning signs began to appear. Satellite data revealed patches of dying trees, their roots shriveled and dry. Entire zones that had once been lush were turning brown again. Investigations soon revealed the cause. The underground water that kept the forests alive was disappearing. To maintain the desert plantations, huge amounts of groundwater had been pumped to the surface. Over time, these underground reserves began to run dry. Without that steady flow of water, even the toughest trees could not survive. Nature was starting to fight back, and the sand that had once been anchored by roots began to move again, swallowing young forests and farmland alike. Scientists warned that while humans could shape the land for a time, the desert always waited for its chance to return. And that warning would soon prove true, because the deserts themselves were no longer just natural landscapes. They were being built upon. Highways, railways, and solar seas. Even as China's deserts fought back, the country was turning its attention to something even bigger, connecting and powering these once isolated regions. This meant building highways, railways, and energy projects directly on sand. It was a vision of progress that required moving, shaping, and stabilizing billions of tons of sand. But it also meant disturbing delicate ecosystems that had survived in balance for centuries. The most striking of these projects was the Taklamakan Desert Highway. Stretching about 562 kilometers across one of the most hostile deserts on Earth, it was a feat of human persistence. Construction crews dug through shifting dunes and loose terrain, removing millions of tons of sand just to create a flat, stable surface. The heat could melt tires, and the wind often buried work areas overnight. Yet after years of effort, the highway opened, linking the oil-rich regions of the Tarim Basin with the rest of China. To keep the road alive, engineers had to solve one of the desert's oldest problems: moving sand. Every kilometer of the highway was lined with irrigated shrubs and trees designed to trap blowing sand. These plants are watered by underground drip systems powered by solar energy. Along the route, small watch stations were built where workers live year-round, maintaining pumps, repairing buried sections, and battling the endless tide of sand. Then came an even more ambitious structure, the Hotan-Ruoqiang Railway. This railway, stretching 825 kilometers, became the longest desert railway in the world. Building it meant carving through dunes and constructing hundreds of bridges to allow sand to pass underneath without burying the tracks. It took more than 10 years and thousands of workers to complete. Today, trains cross the heart of the Taklamakan, carrying goods, fuel, and people across land that was once considered impossible to travel. Farther north, in the Gobi Desert, something similar unfolded. Instead of fighting the sand, engineers decided to use the vast, empty land to harvest sunlight. Giant solar farms started to rise across the dunes, their shiny panels stretching to the horizon. One of the most famous is the Kabuki Horse Solar Farm, built in the shape of a galloping horse when viewed from the sky. With 196,000 solar panels, it provides clean power to tens of thousands of homes, while saving hundreds of thousands of tons of coal each year. Nearby, an even more advanced system appeared, the Gobi Solar Thermal Tower. This 850-foot-tall structure is surrounded by more than 12,000 mirrors that focus sunlight onto a central tower. The light heats molten salt, which stores energy and keeps turbines running even after dark. It is one of the few power plants in the world that can generate electricity both day and night using only sunlight. But this progress came with a price. Every solar farm, railway, and highway required clearing sand, reshaping dunes, and altering the natural flow of wind and water. In some places, scientists began noticing unexpected results. New dunes formed where none had existed before, slowly creeping toward nearby villages. Desert animals like foxes, snakes, and beetles lost their natural habitats. As these mega-projects expanded, experts began to ask a difficult question. Was China saving its deserts or simply creating new ones in a different form? Because its next challenge may not be what nature takes from it, but what it takes from nature. Nature's response and the uncertain future. At first it seemed like China had done the impossible. The deserts were shrinking, new forests were spreading, and entire cities were powered by clean energy drawn from sunlight and wind. But as years passed, a quiet shift began to appear. The land that had been reclaimed from the sands was starting to show cracks, both literally and figuratively. The very efforts meant to control nature were beginning to reveal how fragile that control truly was. In several regions of Inner Mongolia, the trees that once stood proudly as part of the Great Green Wall have begun to die off. Scientists discovered that their roots had reached deep into underground water reserves that could not refill fast enough. Without enough rainfall to replace what was being drained for irrigation, the soil turned hard and salty. What was once green started turning brown again. Patches of forest vanished and the dunes slowly began to move back in. Rising global temperatures made the problem worse. In some areas, rainfall patterns changed completely. Heavy rains would arrive all at once, washing away topsoil, followed by long dry months that cracked the ground open. This unpredictable cycle left farmers unsure of what to plant and when. The land that had been stabilized through decades of hard work was starting to crumble again under the pressure of climate change. At the same time, China's vast network of dams and dredging projects brought new challenges. The country's largest freshwater lakes now experience extreme fluctuations in water levels. During some seasons, they nearly disappear, earning the nickname ghost lakes. The same rivers that once gave life are now struggling to find their natural rhythm. Environmental experts say this is nature's way of pushing back. When humans remove or redirect billions of tons of sand, the landscape adjusts, but not always in predictable ways. The wind finds new paths, the water carves new courses. Forests planted in neat lines begin to break apart as the ecosystem tries to restore its balance. Even the deserts, which once seemed lifeless, move and shift like living beings reclaiming what was taken. China is now rethinking its approach. Instead of planting trees endlessly, scientists are experimenting with mixed forests that mimic natural biodiversity. They are using drones and satellites to track soil moisture, desert expansion, and forest health in real time. Artificial intelligence is being introduced to manage irrigation systems more efficiently, using data to decide where water is truly needed and where it should be conserved. The country's goal remains ambitious: to create a continuous green ring around northern China by 2050, powered by renewable energy, protected by intelligent systems, and sustained by nature itself. But the outcome is uncertain. For every ton of sand China removes, nature seems to shift in response, sometimes cooperating, sometimes resisting. The struggle between human progress and natural balance continues, reminding the world that the Earth always finds a way to restore itself. What do you think about China's projects? Comment down below.